heretic. That was mostly, however, because he was from the Dominican order, and the Franciscans had a lot of power at the time, and the Franciscans hated the Dominicans. And so they had these theological tussles. So poor man, the last number of years of his life, there was a lot of time spent in the Vatican, or in the papal court in Avignon, because it was in exile. But his sermons are quite extraordinary. There's about 60 of them that are preserving. I would recommend Maurice O.C. Walsh's translations. They're free, which is also good, but they're also the best. And his first sermon starts off like this. Here in time, and then he continues. He somehow was able, in his own life of prayer, to use prayer. He also called prayer the unknowing, and he also called it the eternal birth that's always happening. Somehow, in whatever he called this, he also called it the nothing with a capital N. Somehow, his silence was a way for him to step outside of time into a certain kind of experience of eternity. And when that was done, and I don't know if it took him a minute or an hour, I have no idea. But when it was done, he entered back in full of clarity about observing the everyday and refreshed, having taken a little spin through the galaxy. And so they branded him a heretic. But he is uncontainable. And you can even hear the profound influence of his spirituality in his self-defenses before the papal courts. It's amazing. He says things like, well, first of all, it's perfectly clear you haven't understood a word that I've written. So maybe he was a bit of a pain in the ass, but he was also a mystic. And so mysticism and theoretical physics and poetry all have, in a certain sense, something really interesting to say about what time is. And I'd like to put in another thing in there, along with mysticism and theoretical physics and poetry. I'd like to put ministry in there too, because you know so very well that anybody who says that they have no time for interruptions will probably miss many of the real parts of the real job of ministry. And you know yourself too that when you look at maybe 3 months of work ahead of you in ministry, to just think, I don't have a spare minute, and you know spare minutes will be required because chaos happens in your own life and in the life of the people in your congregations, and you know, or in your community work, you know, I'm going to have to find time for people. It's a lovely idea. I know some people who are very good in their diary of only scheduling half their time because they go, yeah, I just know that there's going to be other things that will come up. It's quite extraordinary. They're really good at saying to people, I saw you wanted an hour meeting for an agenda item. I wonder, could we just maybe make that meeting 20 minutes? And that's really helpful, I think, to just say, let me put certain things in containers that actually mean that I've got a little bit more time to just think, now, what letter do I need to write to that person who I know today where they'll really appreciate it? What anniversary do I need to make a phone call about, or to say, I know it's a month to the day since that happened, how are you? To make the time for that, because you've given yourself 40 minutes out of every hour that people might want. I think it's a very interesting approach. It sounds like it's being militant, but actually I think it's being caring, to yourself as well as to others. And I think, who needs an hour to discuss an agenda? I have no idea what your schedule for this week is. I'm not making any points about anything that's on your business time. I did once, there was going to be this European ecumenical meeting at Corrymeela, and there was lasting 4 days, 2 days of theological discussion, which was magnificent, and then 2 days of a business meeting. And I had an inbox of about 1,000, and I was utterly looking forward to sitting down the back of the 2 days of business meeting thinking, I'll have an inbox of 0 by the end of 2 days. Magnificent. Thursday and Friday, I couldn't wait. I was so excited. And Thursday morning, somebody said to me, because it was happening at Corrymeela, somebody said to me, oh, don't you know, it is the honor of the person who leads the centre that's hosting the meeting to chair our business meeting. And hell opened up, the 10th circle. Although, yeah. Actually, Dante Dante has 9 circles of hell, which are very interesting. But he has a pre-circle, which is where he puts the administrators. So, and nothing terrible happens there, but it's just the same thing over and over. At one point I was trying to do something else and somebody put their hand up, stopped the entire meeting and said, Pádraig isn't paying attention. Yes. Yeah. Anyway, I want to give you, we're going to take 4 little investigations. This is why I'm not leading Carmel anymore. I want to take 4 little excursions into 4 different gospel texts looking at time, and particularly looking at interruption. But before we do that, I want you to sit and to think about one question. What's an interruption in your ministry that you'll never forget? I'm not going to ask you to say it because I'm sure some of these things are very private. But what's an interruption in your ministry that you'll never forget? And here's another question. Again, I'm not going to ask you to share it out loud, but what's one sentence from the middle of that story? This is in the context of theoretical explorations about the nature of time, is to think about a time where time became particular, and then to think about how difficult it would be to tell the full story, but just to go, let me tell one sentence of it. I couldn't remember how to turn the kettle on. Or I said not again. Or all of the different things that happen when time and time's nature suddenly pivots and an axis happens. So 4 gospel texts looking at time. First one from the Gospel of Luke. You'll know them all very well, of course, because you're all, very holy people. Luke 19. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there called Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So Zacchaeus hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, he's gone to be the guest of the one who's a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half my possessions, Lord, I'll give back to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I'll pay them 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. So this is in Luke's Gospel, and Luke's Gospel has the early birth narratives, and then there's the time in the wilderness that we looked at yesterday. Then there's the Galilee ministry, which is really a jubilee. It's quite extraordinary in terms of the popularity that happens in the Galilee ministry, most of it. Then Jesus turns his face to Jerusalem, and there's 10 agonizing chapters where Jesus becomes more and more complicated the closer he gets to Jerusalem. And he's gone into Jericho here. He's left Jericho on the way to Jerusalem, and this happens. And 10 complicated narrative chapters. Even from a literary point of view, you can feel the anxiety to go, come on, get to Jerusalem, like what's going to happen? But much more deeply than the literary point of view, you can think of the sense of the anticipation for a people under occupation. Remember I was saying yesterday that Luke's Gospel is a very powerful politic and utterly understandable why people would want to be rid of Pilate, There's mention about the people that Pilate crucified. Pilate is no kind of theoretical philosopher who's just there in a difficult situation. Pilate's got blood all over him. And so here we have this complicated situation of finally arriving at the culmination of Jerusalem, and Jesus stops. So what we see is, first of all, his capacity to interrupt himself, which is an interesting thing. And he interrupted himself because of something that was important to him. And I think, you can argue back with me, but I don't know that Zacchaeus is the interruption. I think the interruption is the situation that Zacchaeus finds himself in. There was hostility in the community. Zacchaeus ran out of the community. He ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see Jesus because he was going to pass that way. The sycamore tree, because it has a wide bough, couldn't be planted inside the community because it was understood that if I was a terrible sinner and I had a tree in my small property that went over into your property and the tree had a wide bough, that the sins of my household would be carried over into the sins of yours. And because the sycamore tree goes widely, they didn't want sycamore trees spreading the sin. So there's a particular law that says that sycamore trees technically should be planted 200 cubits outside of the town. So when it says he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, we're understanding a bit of the context about why you'd need to run to find a sycamore tree, the tree of sin. How interesting that he chose that one. And so in a certain sense, it was the community that disliked this traitor. It was the hostility within which this traitor found himself, that was the interruption. And that seems always to have been something that Jesus of Nazareth noticed, that he was interested in thinking, how does this community hold itself together or not? What are its borders? What rules does it have? And in a strange and frustrating way, Jesus is as attentive to the people who are marginalized because of their sense of being ostracized, for being deemed to be impure or immoral, as those people who are being deemed to be uppity and traitors and well-to-do. Both of those situations Jesus seemed to find troublesome, and he pays attention to it. And then he says, hurry down. He interrupts everything that's happening. Hurry down. I must stay at your house today. There's a way within which time is something very particular is happening here. And then he says the following thing, which I always assume happened in the context of a party. Today salvation has come to this house because he too is a son of Abraham. Is. There's a statement of time here too. Is. Not has been returned to being a member of the household. There's an idea in the understanding of the remnant of Israel that you could argue that some people would have said that because Zacchaeus was working for the occupiers, that he'd rescinded his citizenship. And citizenship isn't the right word, but belonging, I suppose. And Jesus is saying, unfortunately, no. Unfortunately, the inconvenient also belong. And this is a reason, I think, for him to interrupt himself, going towards what he surely knew was going to be torture and execution. He wanted to continue to be himself, even up until the end, which I think is such an interesting thing, that Jesus of Nazareth was willing to be interrupted by some things. He absolutely was, but not others. He was selective in what he allowed himself to be interrupted by. And some of the things he did not want to be interrupted by was empire and empire's outworkings of itself. He had his own understanding of time, and part of the understanding of time is something interesting was just happening in Jericho. I want to say something about it. And interruption isn't just saying, let anything happen any of the time, it doesn't matter. Interruption is about making time for what's important. And we see over and over again what's important. I spent 10 years doing the Stations of the Cross every day. And I think one of the things about the Stations of the Cross is that it demonstrates how Jesus of Nazareth, in the midst of having everything, including his life taken from him, he continued to be himself, which is and to show interest and to notice, which is so fascinating about him. The next text, this is from John's Gospel, John 8. You'll notice this. You'll know this very well. Early in the morning, he came down again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commands us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on do not sin again." First of all, my interpretation of this and how I read this is that the whole thing's a setup. How convenient that people who wished to put Jesus in a spot where he was going to have to choose between what they knew he'd be interested in terms of a person and the law, how convenient, or a certain interpretation of the law, how convenient that there happened to be an act of adultery happening nearby. So to my mind, there isn't a chance that this was random. So because of that, I despise the last part. Do not sin anymore. What does that mean? Be a woman in public? That's, I think, what's facing her. I don't think she had any agency within the context of this. I think it was taken from her, because what they really care about is not her adultery, certainly not the man, whoever he was and wherever he was, probably standing with a stone in his hand. They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. And in the midst of all of this drama, Jesus bends down twice. What an interesting relationship with time. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. They keep on questioning, he straightens up, and then in verse 8, and once again he bends down. What a relationship to time. I've worked for most of the last 20 years in conflict resolution, and one of the things in the context of escalating conflict is that what you have to do is to pay attention to who it is that's setting the metronome for the tempo of this public conversation. And how are they setting it? And is that a trustable tempo to be set? And is the urgency that some people feel, the urgency that everybody needs to feel, is urgency its own sense of a manipulative ploy in order to not make space for something that's important to be said? And you see here that Jesus of Nazareth was so interested in the question of time in response to other people's urgency and in response to a test and a threat. There he is, bending down, writing something random on the ground. Who knows what he was writing? Perhaps an Emily Dickinson poem that was his favourite. The group's hostility toward the woman interrupted him, not the act of adultery. What else was everybody else going to be doing that day? What did she have planned for that day? If this happened in the morning, 11 o'clock, what was she going to do for the afternoon? And did she ever get a chance to do any of that again? Because when you've realized, my God, this is what they'll do to me, what are you going to do then? Presumably in the crowd with stones in their hands were people that she knew, perhaps relatives. What's she going to do? What happens to her time after all of this? Would she want to go back and meet Jesus? Thanks very much, but here we need to have a conversation about the word sin. Some interruptions show where power lies, and this woman saw that her life was a complete commodity upon which men based their conversation about how they judged each other, because her judgment was absolutely assured and was also inconsequential. This was about men in conversation with men, using women as a way to judge other men. Quite extraordinary. Association, the threat of taint, who are you being seen with, and how do you speak there? There's something within the context of this that shows us how interruptions always will have their own politics and are always worthwhile thinking, what's underneath that? And what's underneath that? And what's underneath that? the Toyota factory in Japan is reputed, I don't know if it's true, but it's reputed, it's written about it, to have a system where in the manufacturing lines, if an error ever happens, that rather than just thinking, oh, that person made an error, or that person again made an error, that they ask the question, why, 5 times. Why, in order to think, actually, this error is revealing something larger about the system. And if you ask why 5 times in any of, I shouldn't say any, in some interruptions, isn't it interesting what lines of power come out? Why? How interesting. Recently there was an adored priest in the Midlands of Ireland, adored. Like the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, all love him. He was known by everybody. And he also really enjoyed, when they had a community pantomime, he enjoyed putting on a dress and being the grand dame. He loved being centre stage for that. He had a great voice. And he has recently been fired by the church, which is a rare thing for a Catholic priest to be fired by the church. Not because of anything criminal, but because of what he was doing, dressing up as a woman. It's fascinating when you think about robes as well. Why? What's happening there? What's really happening? He is utterly inconsequential to it, not to himself, but to the machinations of power that are happening in the context of this. But here we see something very interesting. And interruptions have their own power and have their own orbits. Marie Howe is an American poet whose work I love, and she has a book called Magdalene. And she takes Magdalene as a kind of an archetype of the every woman, and looks at the way within which every woman, in religious narratives, in literary narratives, in cultural and political narratives, and in the everyday, has often been put between these axes, are you the mother or the whore? And she looks at everybody through the lens of Magdalene. And so she calls everybody Magdalene, herself, her daughter, her own mother, every woman in the Bible, she calls them all Magdalene. It's an extraordinary book. It's not for the very devout, so let me put that out there. So if you give it to your devout cousin, and your devout cousin returns it because of the penis poetry, don't blame me. So I'm just saying that. You don't need to worry, there's no penises in this poem. Here's a poem called Magdalene the Next Day, which is about the next day after this text that we've just read. And the speaker here is the woman involved. The world that would have gone on without me bargained and clattered, and I walked where I wanted, free of the pretense of family now, belonging to no one. Back to the place where he'd bent and written in the dust. He was a man among men. He knew not to look at them. Whatever he'd scribbled in the dust wasn't there anymore. But he was, standing with his friends in the shade of the temple wall. One of the poetic invitations that Marie Howe has used throughout her life and embodies really is to say, you know that huge thing that happened to you? What happened the next day? What happened 5 minutes later? What did you do then? And I'm not in ministry, but I have found it in terms of my own grief, or when others around me have been in grief, and you're trying to think about what to say, is to just go, what happened then? And the next day. Just to begin that complicated thing to say, what could you see? What happened? One time talking to somebody where somebody had died after a long illness, somebody young. He said, afterwards somebody said, I'll go and make sandwiches. I said, okay. And then when everybody got there, somebody said, I hate ham. There it is, family just happening, 10 minutes after a terrible sadness, and it doesn't bring the dead back from the dead, but one of the things it does is it provides us a small reminder of the complicated way within which time does continue, even after something. And that, I think, is a subtle way of being in relationship to time. 2 more. This is from Mark's Gospel, the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman healed. Another interruption. She's one of my favorites. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had a devil immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the devil out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the little dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the little dogs under the table eat the little crumbs." And he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The devil is gone from your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. So first of all, what I think is so important to say about her is that she was so willing to be the site of interruption. Is he tired? It doesn't matter. I have something important. And you all know what it's like when actually somebody said, "Don't interrupt me today, it's my day off," and you go, "I need to give you news, and I want you to find out now. And I'll keep on calling, even though I know you'll ignore it, thinking it's just me calling about the agenda item. I will find a way to say, I have something to tell you, and this is important." It could be all kinds of things. It's something necessary. I don't have children, but even I, without children, know that when there's young people that I know, and if they want something, and I think, you just kind of go, of course, Recently, a friend's 14-year-old daughter texted and said, "I'm writing an essay about something that happened in Belfast. Can I have a conversation with you?" It's like, of course. I had a terribly busy week, but the answer is, yeah, my God, of course. What a lovely thing that a 14-year-old is texting their parents' friends to say, "We have a conversation," rather than, "Can you get back to me in 3 weeks?" The future. And Jesus is interrupted in his rest too, and I don't think he comes across very well in this. I'm sure lots of you spent lots of time thinking about this. There's of course, many ways to read it. But I don't like it what he says to her. "Let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the little dogs." It is little dogs, it's the diminutive. In the Irish speakers or Gaelic speakers, the word madra is the Irish for dog, and madrine would be the Irish for a little dog, the diminutive. You can do that by adding what's it called, a suffix to the end of the word. I don't think we quite have that. Although we sometimes do use the ette, that we'd borrow some from French. Somebody might say, "Well, we're not going to quite have a retreat. We're going to have a retreat-ette because it's only a day long." That kind of a thing. So people are familiar, even in languages where you don't have a formal suffix to make something diminutive, of finding a way to do it. Or light, L-I-T-E. People will say things like that too. Retreat, light, And so Jesus does use the diminutive. Not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the doggeens, essentially. And she doubles the diminutive because she says, "Oh, but even the doggeens eat the crumbeens." It's quite extraordinary. Literally, when you look at how it's written down, that's what she does. She is the only person of any ethnic or gender or economic background praised for their words by Jesus. "For saying this, you may go. The devil is gone from your daughter." Everybody else is praised for their belief or for other things. She's the only person in any of the 4 canonical Gospels praised for her words. Quite extraordinary. What an amazing capacity she had to not allow herself and her agenda of supreme importance to be interrupted by somebody else's, particular focus or tiredness or xenophobia. I have no idea what was going on, but she wasn't taking it. Quite amazing. And her interruption back, I wonder if this changed him. I hope it did. I wish that we had an annual feast day across all the Christianities of the world, Sunday of Repentance, recognizing that when God decided to become human, God learnt this too. So of course we should. That is a relationship with the question of time, apology, and what the space between recognizing when you've said something that demonstrates your implicit or explicit bias is, and then naming it. It's a really interesting thing that we see here in the context of this. I struggle with this Jesus, and I look at him and admire him and wish to be like him, not in calling people dogs, but in being quick to go, actually, you're right. I'm wrong. How interesting. What a character to follow. One of the things that I know we can often hope for is, I'm exhausted, but I've got 10 days off in August and I'll be able to do all my resting there. Often you get sick. I know lots of people do, because somehow, I have no idea how this happens, but somehow you build all these things up and, I don't know, does your immune system go wrong, or the stress of it all seems to come out, or suddenly that old twinge in your back acts up and you go, I spent the first 3 days in bed, isn't that the way? And so partly as I think about the sense of chronology of Jubilee, there is a way within which what we're looking for is to have an understanding of Jubilee as ever present. Matthew, Mark and Luke have this idea of the second coming that you hear over and over. And the interpretations of that, many of the European interpretations of that, have been through the lens of chronology. When's it going to happen? 1999? Remember Y2K and all the excitement about that? Or when's it going to happen? You'll find websites to say, it's going to all end in 2025 or whatever. It's all very exciting. I'm sure the year 666 had a lot of things going for it as well. That would be one of the things I'd have loved to, if I could travel back in time. Going into the year 665 would be very exciting to eavesdrop into the apocalyptic dooms scrollers. But that's a really poor, I think, reading of time. And I don't think the Bible is proposing that time is chronological. I think the Bible has a very subtle theoretical approach to the question of time and its directions. In a certain sense, like the end of the world happened this morning. It did. You probably got a phone call about it. If it didn't happen to somebody in your orbit, it happened to somebody else's. And for somebody else, the second coming happened this morning too. It's happening all the time. One of the things that these phrases are alerting us to is the fact that the world is always ending and being remade. Made and unmade and made again. Happening all the time. And the question is what is your capacity as people whose imagination is to be present through sacrament? And by sacrament, I don't just mean that in the specifically defined ones. I mean in the broader sense, through giving something tangible to the idea of the intangible. What does it mean to be present, knowing that the world is ending and starting every single day? And how can you give yourself the space within which you can allow yourself to do that without exhausting yourself, knowing that these things are happening? It's interesting, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have this particular way of talking about coming back, which seems like perhaps it's going to be an event. But by the time John comes around, mostly that's gone. There isn't so much of that in John. There is an understanding that life is here and life is now. Enough of the early church had died by that stage that they were thinking, well, he's not coming back very quickly. And so you can see a theological crisis of time that had crept in by the time that the final corpus of the Gospel of John had been put together. And this, I think, is really worthwhile paying attention to when it comes to the question of your own time too, and the question of your own tiredness, is to think, how can I find a bit of rest every day, And how can I not only think that rest will come in my 10 days off in August, but how can I do things that say, what's important for me is the following. I remember how, I like mornings anyway, so I'm not putting this as a template, but I remember how nurturing I found it when I realized if I get up at 5 and choose to spend a number of hours editing poetry, reading poetry, or taking a safari through the work of Meister Eckhart, I just find that my time is my own. And then whatever business comes after that when I open the inbox, fine, whatever. I've just been out in the galaxy. And that meant that then, even on holidays, I get up early because I love it, because it's such a joy. That's not a template. Find the thing that works for you. I also don't have children. I know 99% of you are thinking, yeah, right. So I know all of that's true. What I'm saying is find whatever works for you. I'm not putting it across that there's one way to do it. It could be while the kettle boils. I have a friend who has a very busy life and says, the center point of my day is after I've made tea and the 7 minutes between when I've made the tea and when it's steeping. That's 7 minutes that I count as precious, and everybody knows. Just leave mum have that. Fascinating to look at what's doing, and partly I think it's the generosity of imagination that allows time to expand, rather than I've got 3 hours now ahead of me to do something. I was living in New York up until recently for the last 7 months, and my sister, who has 2 children under 7, one of whom wants to be a spy in the future. She dresses up in magnificent costumes and says, I'm a spy. Amazing. She's 4.5. My sister said that the thing she was most looking forward to about coming to visit me in New York was 6 hours on a plane being uninterrupted. You all know that. Here's the last text, the rich young man. Then, this is from Matthew 19. Then little children were being brought to him in order that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples spoke sternly to those who brought them, but Jesus said, let the little children come to me, and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs. And he laid his hands on them and went on his way. Then someone came to him and said, Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life? And he said to him, why do you ask me about what is good? There's only one who is good. And if you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments. He said to him, which ones? And Jesus said, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother. Also you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The young man said to him, I've kept all of these. What do I still lack? Jesus said to him, if you wish to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. When the young man heard this word, he went away grieving, for he had many possessions. There's so many things that we could talk about in this, and I know that you'll have many thoughts. First of all, the children are so interesting. That little part that comes before. Little children being brought to him in order that he might lay his hands on them and pray. A blessing, something nice, just a story to tell children in the future. And also a different way of approaching the question about what's going on. So often during lockdown on Zoom calls, when somebody's child interrupted them, they might be embarrassed, but other people are like, it's a child, how lovely, how magnificent. And so I think there's a way within which there's something very contemporary happening in the question of being interrupted here. And there's the objection to the interruption of those people who were objecting, who probably also felt like what they were doing was important. There's a question that's happening here where the man says, what good deed must I do to have eternal life? There's a certain frenetic relationship with the question of the present and the future. What can I do today that will ensure the future is certain? Nothing is the answer. That's the answer. How can I predict the future? You can't. How can I make sure I get into heaven? What are you doing today? Annie Dillard says, the way you live a day is, of course, the way you live a life. It's a slight misquotation, but it's such an interesting line, which is a question to say, if you're obsessed about the future, what are you doing today? What's happening? What are you doing at 11 o'clock? What's going to happen at 3:30? If you think the future will be perfect after something particular, how can you do it now? In conflict work, often when people are focused on a particular kind of conflict, they'll say, what will you do when it's all resolved? Well, it'll never be resolved. Like, oh. So are you planning on being as committed to not resolving it as you are into this sentence? It's a crisis to have to face the possibility of getting what you want. It's terrible. I've seen some people going, I know that after this is all finished, I'll be able to spend a bit more time with my children. To go, how about you do that now? A little bit, just 2 or 3 minutes more, Just a little bit longer. Don't rush away from the table, you know. How about you do the very thing that you're fantasizing and projecting into the distant future in the here and now? And I think this is one of the crises that this man is facing. And I don't think his crisis is about holiness or about religion. I think his crisis is about addiction to perfection. Because that's the answer, that's the question that Jesus answers. He's asking about eternal life. And Jesus says to him, if you wish to be perfect, do the following. I think Jesus discerned that this man's crisis was perfection, and that if I live a perfect life, I can predict the future. Jesus is going, well, let me show yourself back to yourself. In other editions of this text across other Gospels, you see that lovely insertion of Jesus looked at him and loved him. And I love that line. I think it just shows that maybe Jesus had been a bit similar to that too. How did he love him? How did he know that? I used to have a terrible predilection for apologizing for everything all the time, thinking it was all my fault, which is on the one hand an indication of sadness, and on the other hand an indication of a ridiculously inflated ego to think that I was so powerful that everything could be my fault. So it was as much pride as it was anything else. And years ago I met a guy who was only a year or two younger than me. He was coming to do a course in a place where I was running the course, and I felt like I was meeting myself, although perhaps slightly exaggerated, because he apologized for everything. It was quite extraordinary. And I tried to help, but I wasn't able to help. But I remember feeling like I want to help, because I looked at him and loved him and thought, I see you, yeah. In the context of this question too, about what can I do now that will ensure the predictability of the future, one of the things I think of here is, and I'm not being callous when I say this, I'm defending myself before I even say it, which is a bad idea. But I think about how is it that we can bring this kind of imagination about time into how we do strategic planning and business planning. Because so much of business planning is how can we predict the future? And I really do think that business planning and strategic planning is helpful. I'm not thinking, no, just do what you want, it doesn't matter, it'll all happen. I don't think like that. But what I do think is that it's really worthwhile thinking, what are we going to do and how in our business plan are we going to make space for saying, and then we'll reflect on what we've seen. And we'll respond theologically today and tomorrow and next year. We will ask questions. And so much of funding happens on outcome, impact, delivery. And what's interesting is to pay attention when I've been working with funders over the years to say, well, we don't know what the outcome will be because we don't know the future, because it hasn't happened yet. What we do know is that we're well positioned to do these things and then to say with deep trust, what happened for you? What did you notice? And to learn from that and to say, we will then share that with you about what we've learned. And that, I think, is a relationship with time too, and a relationship with money. I'm going to finish by giving a few thoughts about what I think a spirituality of time might be. But I want to say, yesterday when we had a session in the afternoon, we talked a bit about trauma. I'd mentioned it a bit yesterday too. And trauma is often taken as a personal experience. I've had trauma, therefore I need to go to therapy. That can be very helpful. But trauma is something much more collective as well than that. For instance, like there was a good reason after the 11th of September why over New York City was declared a no-fly zone for a long time, because so many people on a collective level were looking up and seeing anything that flew across the skies as thinking, is it going to explode? How frightening, how terrible. That was a collective understanding of the question of time and trauma. In conflict theory, we understand that a conflict takes as long to de-escalate as it took to escalate. And let me be Irish here. A mild, a modest, a very modest, possibly even insulting reckoning of time when it comes to the presence of Britishness in Ireland is to look at the time when Ireland was declared part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in 1801 in that Act of Union. and to measure the time between that and the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, 200 years, give or take a couple of years. And so when it comes to looking at the question of the re-establishment of normality between Britishness and Irishness on the island of Ireland, because Britishness on the island of Ireland has been a complicated thing for us to reckon with for 800 years, never mind 2. It is a modest imagination to say the first time really that we should begin to ask, have relations normalized, is the year 2200. Maybe 2198 if you want to be specific. Okay, that's a modest reading of the amount of time. Now, I'm not saying therefore let's do nothing. What I am saying is that a political cycle of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years will not define what it is that can be achieved. As you look at any of the traumas in the world and you think, right, we want to have a peace agreement, we want to have a weekend retreat, we want to put a plaque up in the church to acknowledge our wrongdoing, and then it's done. It's the last part that's the problem for me. I'm delighted with plaques, I'm delighted with retreats, I'm delighted with acknowledgements, I'm delighted with reparations, all important. It's the and then it's done part that is often unvocalized, but I think is very powerful to go, then we can get on with the real work. No, you can't. We'll all be dead before the real work eventuates when it comes to the question of reckoning with the injustices that have plagued our world. The question is are you willing to be part of the crafts making of that cathedral of belonging that we hope society can be? That's the question of our endeavour and our working toward justice. None of us will see what we hope, what we know we need to see, but will we get in the way? That's the question. I will not see Ireland restored to what I wish Ireland could be. Speaking our own damned language. My God. At the age of 5, I asked my parents, why do we speak English? They said, there's a place called England. That was my introduction to British-Irish politics at the age of 5. People say to me, how did you get political? It was like, it's impossible not to be when you grow up speaking a language that's not your own. And that's a mild experience, I think, of colonialism in Ireland. It's mild. And so the question of time must be understood in a collective imagination and not pathologized into individual people who are rightly speaking out about the way that time needs to be rethought. But we must understand that and then we'll get on with the real work that might be part of the imagination unspoken after the plaque is put up, that is actually the real agenda. How can we do anything to shut you up from being annoying? A weekend retreat and a plaque will not shut justice up, but nor will thinking that it's achievable next year. The question is, how are we being co-craftspeople in a cathedral of belonging that we are building towards for the future? That too is a spirituality of time. So when you think about time, what does an interruption evoke for you in the context of your relationship with time? Do you think it's running out? Do you think that time's only going in one direction? Or do you think that it depends on you also? I know that sometimes so many jobs are set up in a way where if you think, I'm sick, I have to take a day off, you therefore think, right, well, I'll be working extra hard when I go back. You know, it's not like somebody else does the work for you. I think lots of your jobs are in that kind of situation where you're just thinking, okay, a holiday's a bit stressful because the first week back is kind of slightly bonkers, or slightly more bonkers. And I think that's really worthwhile thinking about, and thinking about as an employment issue, and thinking about as a right to fair work issue in terms of looking at that, and coming up with ways where you can communicate to people, to say parishes or other congregations of people that you're working with, to say, here's what it's like for me to have a relationship with time, which means I can serve you, especially when it comes to some time off. Because there can be this idea that the world will fall apart if I'm not doing it too, which is also, unfortunately, a form of egoism. We all know that somebody gets sick, somebody dies, and actually lots of the work continues. We miss them. But we are both the centre and not the centre of everything. And we need to find some kind of wisdom, which isn't abdication, but nor is it self-adulation. And what does any interruption evoke in me when it comes to my own relationship with myself? Do I think I'm worthless if I don't keep whoever I'm trying to keep happy? You know, that's worthwhile, allowing yourself to breathe into that in your prayers. And what does the interruption evoke in me when it comes to my relationship with a measurement of success? And what measurement of success is being measured here? Who defines it? Who am I wishing to keep happy? That's often operating when it comes to the question of success. And it's not that the person you're wishing to keep happy is this nasty overlord. It might be your kids, you know. It might be your neighbour. It might be your spouse. It might be somebody that you really care about. It could be anybody, you know. But it's worthwhile thinking, what measurement of success am I trying to seek here? And just noticing that can sometimes help, I think. Just finding a way to notice. Then what does the interruption evoke in me in terms of my biases, conscious or unconscious? I think that is so clearly demonstrable in the story of the Syrophoenician woman, you know, referring to her as a little dog. What does the interruption evoke in me in terms of my capacity to name where I'm wrong? And how long does it take for me between it being said to me believing it, me doing something about it, me saying something about it? And what would it mean to pay a particular kind of attention to those? Ignatius of Loyola has been an old friend of mine for a long time, and he has this great suggestion about planning for your day the day before, and he kind of suggests to plan for a bit of disappointment. And it's so worthwhile thinking. He calls it active detachment. He says, just think about what you know is going to happen tomorrow, or what you think, what's planned for tomorrow. And think about the thing that you think is going to be terrible and that you're dreading. And just step back from that and notice your dread and just go, oh, I'm thinking that that's going to be awful. I wonder, will it be? Just even ask yourself that question. I wonder, will it be? Because you know what it's like, that thing, I don't know, is it the dentist or is it something else, where you just go, oh, I'm dreading it. And then you come away going, that's nowhere near as bad. But then he also says, think of the thing that you think is going to be absolutely brilliant tomorrow. I'm going to have the best time at lunch with my best friend. It's just going to be amazing. And then something happens. They can't turn up, or they're late, or when they turn up, they're consumed with something else, or they're in a weird mood or something, and you walk away thinking, I'd actually pinned a lot of my hopes on that. And so what he says is, prepare for a little bit of disappointment. He doesn't say it like that, but he says, just begin to notice what you're expecting. Because he says you're called to something important, what he calls your principle and foundation. You're called to something important. What are you going to let interrupt that? And this, I think, is what we see manifested in the character of Jesus of Nazareth, is that he had what Ignatius would call a deep sense of his principle and foundation. He didn't even let his own agenda of getting to Jerusalem interrupt that when he saw it in the community of Jericho. Because he thought, this is important. I'll interrupt myself here. How interesting. What a fascinating way to know something powerful about yourself and to have a certain rudder when it comes to the question of interruption. I'll finish with a little story. Years ago, I was on a bus, the number 16 bus, coming back from reparative therapy, actually. My God, I'd been forced into reparative therapy to keep the job I was doing with Christian organization. I was coming back from reparative therapy and I was about to be late for a meeting, and I hate being late. And I was sitting on the bus, and there was a woman next to me who said to me, when are you getting off, son? And I told her, and she said, can you stay on the bus with me for a couple of stops longer, because I need help carrying my shopping. And I just thought, well, you can't say no. Like, it's the quintessential little old lady. That's not a phrase I use now, but it was that kind of situation. And so I said, okay, sure. We got chatting. She was a complete character. She told me she was in her late 80s. And so we got off the bus, and she handed me, you know those string bags that are put together, you know? It had an apple in it, I think, and something small in a bag, maybe a card. Like, it was not heavy. But it was about the weight of this. So we got out and we started to walk. She linked her arm into mine. She was tiny. And we were walking along. She was just wandering along, delighted with herself. I was just thinking, what's going on? And somebody who clearly knew her walked by the other way, a younger person, and said to her, and looked at her, looked at me and looked back at her, and said, "How are you, Mary?" And Mary, as I now discovered her name to be, looked around and said, "Some girls never lose their touch." This is completely true, and I'm not exaggerating anything. Like, there's word for word. And I said to her, "I think I've been had." And she goes, "You certainly have, son." And I suddenly thought, screw being late. Who cares? What a magnificent woman. It was 1994. I mean, she still might be around, you know, charming and flirting with innocent Egypts on the bus. I would love to know her family, to tell them that story, because I would like to hear all the other stories, because that comes out of a life lived according to her principle and foundation, which was charm and magnificence, and I think a relationship to time that was generative, that was beautiful, and that I've never forgotten. And in all of this, I wish for you a generosity of your own time, because I know it's pressured, as well as a generosity about what time can mean for you, because there'll never be enough of it, but there might be a way to enter into the little that there is with something that can be flourishing and nurturing. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.